Bria, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Bria. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm like a writer and museum worker, throwing myself around Manchester, trying to anything that sticks. Mm-hmm. And I like to write nonfiction, but also dabble in creative fiction as well.
Mm-hmm. And haven't you also just got a virtual residency as well with Melbourne?
I'm also a virtual resident with the Royal Historical Society of Victoria, so which is bloody fantastic, and I wouldn't have gotten it without the work, the likes of like Rainbow Library and Manchester City Lit. So, work with these guys.
And it's very well deserved as well. Wing Yu, what about you?
Hi, my name is Wing Yu. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the founder of RICE, which is a creative writing project for the East and Southeast Asian community, and I like writing short stories.
Very good short story. Didn't you get long-listed or short-listed for something recently?
Yes, I got long-listed for the Forthright Short Story Prize.
I was on this project, and I still am, kind of. I don't know.
It never ends.
It never ends.
Never ends.
Trapped for life.
Okay. And we are here to talk about the Rainbow Library project. Firstly, what was that? Does anyone know actually what it happened last year? Early 2022 was the year that it was then.
Yeah.
So what actually was it? What did we do? Also, I'm Libby, by the way.
That's what
I was a coordinator, I wasn't a participant, but I was there at the time. What was the project? What happened?
I'm happy to start, and then you guys can add on this. But the Rainbow Library project was a project across multiple cities, I believe, where we were working with a professional author, Jay Hume, and a professional illustrator called David Roberts. David, I just know him as David at this point. So we talk about professional writing, and then we were being guided through the process of creating our own writing based on everything we've learned and everything we believe about queer literature and about children's literature and young adult literature, especially. Into the wonderful excerpts of writing you can see outside and also online of our project.
Anything you want to add to that, Bria?
Yeah, basically it was just like a series of workshops where every kind of like session was focusing on different elements of writing, publishing, illustrating. So David and Jay would kind of like alternate. So for example, one week David would lead us through like an illustrating exercise to kind of like stretch the muscles a little bit and get us to think about, okay, this is what illustrating and publishing actually works when it comes to children's books. So how do you kind of keep it engaging? How do you ensure kids kind of like actually pay attention to it? And then Jay, using his combination of like knowledge as like a poet and also as a writer as well, will then talk about like form, structure, and implementing that into our writing. One of the main entryways that we all kind of drew a lot of inspiration from were some of the fairy tales that they brought to the sessions. So I think we spent a good few sessions both at People's History Museum and Manchester Central Library just reading fairy tales and just talking about like what stories resonate with us as children and kind of carrying that in our practice. And those kind of just developing building blocks to then like produce stories that, as Finch said, you can kind of like read like outside under the Rainbow Library banner. And yeah, it was just basically a very kind of semi-structured but also very fluid kind of way to kind of like grow together and learn together and like discuss what writing kind of means to us.
And what sort of level would you say you were at before then? Was it completely new to you writing for young people at that point, or had you kind of thought about it before?
Yeah, it was completely new to me to write a children's story. So that was a really exciting and also very challenging opportunity for me. It was like writing a really long free verse poem. I loved it.
I'd love if you could tell us a bit more about your one, Wing Yu, because it was Jack and the Beanstalk, wasn't it, that yours was inspired by?
My story was inspired by Jack and the Beanstalk. I was really intrigued. So I told my story through the perspective of the giantess, who in the original story is known as the giant's wife. And I thought she was such an interesting character because she helps Jack to escape. But in the original story, she's a minor character. And I thought I'd give her a voice in the version I wrote. And I'd also turn the giant's family into a Chinese family who was celebrating Lunar New Year that day when Jack comes.
And what was the process like of developing that over the course of the workshops then?
Um,
Like, do you think you started out with a fully formed idea, or was it kind of experimenting and getting to what it eventually became?
yeah, it was a lot of experimenting, and also when thinking about a children's story, I was also thinking in terms of how illustrations would complement the text. And so I really enjoyed writing. There was a scene where I was writing a lot about the spread of food. Yeah, that was really fun, thinking about how like illustrations could complement that. And really fun with it.
What about you, Bria? What did you work on?
So I kind of worked on a like retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, and that was telling it from the perspective of Red is actually kind of like the adopted daughter of the woodswoman, as and kind of like single parent butch household, fantastic. And this is kind of a story where kind of like Red kind of leaves like the woodswoman's house because she notices she's kind of part of like deforestation. She's kind of part of a cycle that kind of is destroying the forest, and to develop this like industrial city, and basically joins the wolves in trying to stop deforestation and committing like eco-terrorism. So so and that's kind of the angle I wanted to go down. Basically, just because I loved Little Red Riding Hood when I was like younger, and I think it's always fascinating thinking, like who gets to kind of be the monster in the story, and how like reaching out to get that kind of level of community and rethinking like human and animal relationships. And yeah, and and going back to your point when you about like illustration, I think what was quite freeing about that was kind of Jay and David said you don't need to be so like into the words or like stretch yourself out, because the illustration will carry the story. Like often you don't need to say there was a red door that they opened. You could just say there was a door, and the illustration will have a red door. So you're kind of almost freeing yourself and saying, oh, okay, I can just leave this to the visual elements to kind of carry it and focus on like the meat of the story. But yeah, so that was kind of like a fascinating process. But honestly, I say kind of like monstrosities nowhere near as cool as Finch's story.
Yeah, we'll get on to Finch's.
Yeah, no, I feel like you've got another question for
already
Bria.
been set up. But I just want to say like that saving the world is such a queer thing to add into young people's literature, to be like climate change is bad. What can we do to actually fix the planet? That feels like what do you think the relationship between like the political in that story was when you were writing it? Do you think it felt like a very natural component of it?
I think it felt very, very natural. Like we're kind of at a zenith where young people and kids in schools are kind of leading an Extinction Rebellion and like Just Stop Oil movements. So it just kind of felt right to kind of include that. And it's for me when we think of kind of queer people and the politicalness of being a queer person, you're kind of always like fighting against the system in a way. So there is that kind of natural element of that. As soon as you're kind of outside what is normal, outside those structures, ideally you want to be fighting for a change and fighting to kind of improve things. So that's kind of where I wanted to like angle that, like not be like a preachy moralistic book that like some kids books which are kind of like have their place but aren't exciting, but more just it's cool to smash up at a factory. And that's kind of where I wanted to angle in towards.
Yeah, for sure. Now Finch, tell us about your
Yeah, no, you've hyped me up now, which is so I originally was going to write like a short story, and then the world of I'll start. It's Pinocchio. It is a queer reimagining of Pinocchio through a lens of horror. I'm very inspired by Emily Snicket, R.L. Stein, Scary Stories of Time in the Dark. And one of the things I learned the most of on Rainbow Library was through David showing me some of like the scary children's books he's illustrated, and the like not being afraid to like be scary and like actually try and like write horror for kids and not to like look down on these or like or anything like that. And I've been attached to Pinocchio my entire life. It was the first song I ever sung in musical theatre, was I Got No Strings, and Pinocchio has always been this intrinsically autistic and intrinsically non-binary character that I really wanted to work with. And so I came into it knowing as soon as it was like do a fairy tale, I was like, okay, it's Pinocchio. But then this whole world came to me to the point where what you actually see in the book outside is only the first chapter. And I kind of ended up writing, and I've still been writing to this day, this middle grade book and then like series and all of these characters. And what it is essentially is specifically a circus breakout kidnapping type story where it's kind of like Pinocchio's trapped in the circus and there's this incredible cast of characters, and with the help of the wonderful drag queen Miss Adventure, they all like escape and then they're all best friends forever. But it's like also very scary, and there's like a very intense almost body horror sequence with like puppeteering that I've been working on, and I never expected to like find a story that I was this passionate about writing and honestly getting published through Rainbow Library. I was more expecting to hone my craft, and then it's like, no, it's a world that means a lot to me now, and I'm hopeful that you will get to read the whole thing eventually.
It's amazing, and it started out so strong as well, but I'm so happy that you're continuing to write it as well, because it was always such an exciting concept. I think it's so interesting hearing you talk about like being able to be horrible in children's books. Like, how do you deal with that relationship? How, with the big question, I think that kind of comes up in queer stories a lot anyway, of what is appropriate to tell people, let alone what is appropriate to tell young people. So how do you deal with that when you're writing for young people in that way?
I think a lot of it is like kind of start with the most like horrific idea I could think of, and then we pare it back so much. I don't want to, because I think the first few drafts I was like, oh well, we can't talk about that, we can't talk about like the horror of being detached from your parents and all of that, and I was like, no, this is like a story. But I remember specifically there was a line in the first chapter which is I bet you can't imagine the day you were born. And like the sort of almost existentialism of being in the womb and like not existing. And it was David who kind of encouraged me to actually like get a little bit existentialist with it almost. And then like, because I work with these kids now, I teach at Zen Arts, and we were talking about we were doing a book about The Wild Robot, which is an incredible middle grade story, and they were talking about like death and all of these concepts that they were like grappling with, and I was like, no, yeah, like children's books can also engage with these scary and uncomfortable topics just in a different way, and if you keep the tone consistent, there is a lot more that you can say in that tone. And I think a lot of it is just use your common sense. Like we're not creating like a Saw movie here, obviously, but as long as you're keeping the tone and you're keeping your common sense, there's a lot that we can talk about in these children's, specifically middle grade. I'm not saying like picture books. I'm not suggesting that, but like,
Why not?
it depends on your illustrator, I suppose. But no, I think it's like it's okay to be daring, and I'd rather be pulled back from it than not have achieved a scary story, because that is what it is at the end of the day.
Amazing. Yeah, I think you talk about a little bit your relationship as a queer person when writing that as well, and I want to open that up to you guys now too. Like, the program was 16 to 25 year olds who identified as queer who could, and it was of a very high standard as well. We had a lot of applications for it, and only chose the best of the best, as you can tell. But I wondered, when you're writing your stories, which are obviously quite intrinsically queer because they're very subversive in lots of different ways, do you think that your identity had a bearing on it when you were writing it, or was it just you're writing from your perspective, so that's what came out? Like, when you did, how did that feel when you were writing? Was it relevant? It might not even have been.
I think because I wanted to see, I guess I wanted to retell the story through the perspective of I guess, a Chinese person, and to the celebrations that I have in my culture, so like Lunar New Year. That's what excited me, and the way for me to retell the story in a way that was unique to me and that was personal to me.
Amazing. What about you, Bria?
I'm just trying to kind of like think back on some of the themes. I personally identify as bisexual, and even though I use like she her pronouns, it's with more begrudging acceptance, and it's with kind of like what I feel comfortable right now. And I kind of wrote Little Red as being non-binary, like they use they them pronouns, and I think I kind of use that to explore like, well, okay, if you could like try to explore like that part of myself, and like in terms of presenting identity. But I think it was interesting. I always view my queerness as something that I kind of use it to kind of like step in and out of multiple things. Like you don't need to be categorized. You're kind of almost like limitless in what you can do. And I think being also kind of thinking about, Little Red and like the wolf and the idea of the werewolf as being a very queer icon, and that like it's, you're kind of half in, half out. You almost feel as if you need to like hide yourself to avoid being attacked by villagers. So I think I kind of just like glued myself onto that, in trying to explore that. But yeah, I'm actually not entirely sure. Like I think it was more like the community values of queerness in regards to kind of like community, refusing to be defined, wanting to be subversive, were the ones that kind of influenced me more than kind of like the romantic or like sensual side of it.
I feel like you've got something.
No, I mean, like I said, I also kind of wanted to talk about my narrator, who is also a character in and of themselves, and I think that their relationship to Pinocchio as this sort of intrinsically asexual, agender, like a romantic character, and I just really love this unknowable figure of the narrator that is kind of like this gender fluid, like omniscient thing that like is also a character in and of themselves, which is later in the book. It's not in the actual anthology at all, but like I think that it's kind of like both halves of myself that are both being put into the story, which I think is really nice. Yeah.
It kind of ties in as well to that beautiful parallel you just drew, Bria, between the story itself and the kind of stories that you're telling as a queer person about your identity throughout the world, just figuring out how you explain yourself and your attractions and your path through life, while also hopefully involving some fairy tale creatures at some point, ideally some werewolves. I'm going to open it up in a minute, so you guys have to start thinking about questions to ask and things to say. But I wanted to ask, what do you think the future of LGBT stories is, or could be, or should be? I know it's a big question, so you can take a second to think about it if you want.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where, depending on what mood I'm in and what I've read on the news that day, I can be either very cynical or very optimistic. Yeah. Like I'm optimistic of like what's coming next and the next generation of writers, and the fact that, there's more interest and more desire for, like queer stories for all audiences, like seeing queer identities, not just, dirty, that's only for adults, rather than, oh no, this is a natural thing that people of all ages and of all kind of like communities can kind of like engage with and learn more about. But on the flip side, it's also kind of like, well, how do we ensure we're not like selling ourselves out for capitalist interests? Like, where's the support for our communities in like a political and social sense? It's all well and good telling our stories, but who's going to ensure, we survive to tell those stories? And that's kind of where it all like boils down to, with the whole like, as Joe mentioned, like in her opening speech, about this is a very weird political climate to be in, where like our trans siblings are basically being threatened to refused to have their stories being told, and kind of being trying to be silenced. And then you have in the States, queer books being pulled from school libraries. And it's like these stories are out there, they're being told, but there's almost being gatekept from people who probably need it most. So I guess it's kind of like a two-pronged thing of like, there's more of us to tell these stories, but we also kind of have to carry that double burden of like ensuring those stories are told and not being censored. So we do have a fight in our hands, but it's still like a better kind of world we're living in than say when under Section 28 when we couldn't even talk about it. So I guess it's, you know, as with all kind of thinking about the future kind of questions, is like you kind of like excited, but also kind of a bit like fearful of what kind of comes next.
Yeah, for sure. With that kind of taking a few steps forward and then feeling like we're suddenly taking some steps back again, that's quite scary. Like people have realised that they've got stories to tell, they might want to, but then they might not have the chance to if things keep going in a certain way. Bench.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the sort of conflict that I've tried to put the words in that you did so well. But I think this is a fight that will be won, and I like to be confident that like queerness in general will be free and accepted, and that any of the bullshit now is going to win, because I can't see that happening, really. And I don't want to like exist in a world where this isn't a war that will be won. And that's, I think, also it's really important that it's this duality of like, I think the stories need to be told, but I think we also need to be here. And I really think that we're coming into an age now where the author is almost just as public as the book a lot of the time. And I think that, like, again, I have this whole like fantasy of doing like drag story times of my book one day, and like fully just, which sucks. It sucks that that's like, that we have this role, that we also have to take on this additional burden alongside already taking these massive risks. So like they said earlier, with our own stories that just like represent us are being seen as risks to be taken. And I think a lot of that is going to come through small publishers. I think a lot of it's going to come through, I think it is a fight, and I think eventually it is going to be won, but I think it's going to be difficult, and it sucks that we have to do that. But like, if I ever get lucky enough to like have like a published book, I am going to be just as public about myself as I am about my book. And I think the same is I think there's gonna be a lot of people like that. I think of like Alison Rumfitt, which is completely not children's literature at all, but like people, a lot of like these new queer film directors and queer actors and queer poets, and I think it's just the personal is the political, and also the stories is the fictional is the political, and everything's political, and eventually we're just gonna have to. Eventually we're gonna win, but it's gonna be hard, and it's gonna be long, and it's gonna suck. But yeah,
but the world deserves to see that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the world deserves to have that queer story time with you. I would love to see that. That would be amazing. What about you, Wing Yu? Have you had any thoughts about the future of LGBT stories?
I think overall it'll be positive. I was thinking about what I'd like to see more of. I guess just like more diversity within diversity and voices within LGBT stories. Like, I guess for me, I'd love to see more like perspectives, Chinese perspectives, queer Chinese perspectives, or queer East and Southeast Asian perspectives. Like recently I found out about this film festival called Queer East.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it was really nice to see experiences, because queer experiences can be so nuanced, especially if you bring in like culture and ethnic backgrounds and how that influences that. and like specific family dynamics, and it was affirming and it was really lovely. I also think there should be more representation for trans men. Yeah, I guess because I used to date a trans man, and because of that, I became very aware of how little representation they have in general, like in the general public, and also within the LGBT community itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was quite because of Jay. Jay's a trans man and so incredible in so many ways as a children's book writer. I think because I hadn't experienced that side of queer stories in that way before, being introduced to it through a trans male writer made me think, oh, this must be a huge thing. This must be very normal. And then was very surprised and disappointed that it wasn't as much. But I think that's a really important thing to bring up as well.
Just learning about neuroqueerness, and every time I get like any sort of platform, I will talk about neuroqueerness. This is just like a thing, which is specifically the intersection between neurodivergency and queer identity, and the nuances that upholds. And everything I do is about that. Whenever I do drag, whenever I do poetry, whenever I do comedy or anything like that, it is coming from that lens of both being othered and yet also, and just like autistic experience and like queer experience and mental health, which is a whole lot like Mad Punk and like Mad Pride and all of that, also very important to me. And also, and the fact that I was a child once, I suppose, and having the realization that like I write books for children who were me, and not all of those children necessarily are going to go around saying I'm autistic, I'm queer, but a lot of them will still have that same experience. And I think realizing that I'd read my own books, like, and like people, and that, and also J.K. Rowling. I'm going to talk about. I'm sorry, but also realizing that she was terrible was like a really big moment for me, deciding that I wanted to be a writer professionally at some point in my life, because I don't want to be her. And I think other people, ideally, I think that people like us and people like who come through the Rainbow Library or whatever can drown her out in the noise.
Positive representation, and like finding a community as well felt like a big part of that. What about you guys? Is there anything?
I think what for me helps me to believe that I can be a writer is, in a way, like being surrounded by people who believe in what you do and support me in my writing. I think positive affirmations is great.
Yeah, that kind of ties into the community thing as well, because you are all phenomenal writers in your own right as well, but having people recognise that as well and take you seriously, I think. I mean, I might be projecting, but I feel like the Rainbow Library was a space where it was kind of taking people seriously in what they were making.
Can I say something really quickly?
Yeah, go on.
Like, I didn't realize that Rainbow Library was even like competitive until like the beginning of this talk, which is now like, oh wait, no, that's why we were like,
there was a level.
There was a level. Oh my god, I was on a level, guys. That's crazy. I made the cut.
Bria.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things in that I feel a lot more comfortable in nonfiction writing, like the kind of like canon, as Mendez referred to in their earlier keynote speech. You know, I'm very much someone who like reveres the writing of like Susan Sontag, Andrea Longchu, as well as countless other kind of like queer writers like James Baldwin and all those guys like that come before me. but I think kind of realizing I could write fiction and like creative fiction wasn't something I explored until like I got onto Rainbow Library. And it was a very kind of like communicative, chilled out like experience where we were able to kind of like push each other and discuss ideas and like talk about how we kind of all drawn each other, I suppose. And again, being led by like David and Jay was just fantastic in trying to kind of like challenge and stretch myself into a way. I thought, oh, okay, I didn't realize I could actually do this. So it kind of inspired kind of taking a greater leap into writing into fiction more generally. And I think that was kind of like the light bulb moment.
Maybe start with, is it intimidating?
Yeah.
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 Yeah, it's one of those interesting ones where David and Jay talks a little bit about publishing. At the end of the day, it kind of comes down to marketing, and I suppose I can't say for kind of Wing and Finch, but from my perspective, publishing very much still feels a big thing that happens to other people and not myself. Like, it's not something I can kind of meet at their level, and whether or not that's just down to the like an ignorant perspective of not knowing about like northern publishing houses, but I think in regards to kind of like creating a safe space for people into it, honestly, just having kind of like more like talks, networking spaces, and basically more is more at the end of the day. Basically kind of like myth busting on publishing and how that works and how like what does it actually mean to be published. Because we're kind of in an interesting era where, book talk going viral on book talk is now like a big thing that apparently people care about nowadays. Like, how do you kind of talk about that with someone who has no interest in kind of like marketing their book? So I guess it's just trying to, bring it down to like a level playing field.
Yeah.
Is how I kind of view that.
Anything you'd want to add to that? No?
Can I add something?
Yeah.
So, the other thing is, on top of all of that, children's publishing is a whole other industry at this point.
Yep.
And, like, going viral on Book Talk doesn't necessarily happen to your middle grade project. And and every time I go to one of these, I go to these panels, on the other end of the panels, with like published authors, and I'm like, how did you get published? Blah, 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 blah. Like, I've never and then it's half of the advice is just completely unapplicable, and also because I feel like for children's publishing, self-publishing isn't even that big of an option because it is very hard because like kids deserve books, kids deserve great books, kids deserve great books, kids deserve books from all over the UK and all over the world, and yet that sort of industry is never as spotlighted in what little we do get. Children's publishing specifically, we don't have like a Cypher Press or a Comma Press or anything like that for children's literature yet. I think the closest is like Nosy Crow, I guess. Maybe Hotkey Books used to be like a niche thing. It's not anymore, but it used to be pretty niche. That used to be like. I don't know.
I guess it's difficult as well because as you probably told from my accent, I grew up in the States, in that there's a lot of kind of like bleeding between like American publishing houses and like the American kind of publishing market. So I guess we're kind of thinking, oh yeah, Penguin Books is like, okay, I guess it's English, but also what about so there's like Simon and Schuster, and we import a lot of young, like especially in the young adult range, American books. So I guess it's just kind of thinking, when you think of publishers, are people thinking about like American publishers rather than British publishers?
Yeah.
And just trying to kind of, square that idea, I suppose.
Yeah.
I write short stories and poetry, so that's quite like a solitary way to write. But when I was writing and thinking in terms of illustrations, I was thinking about in what ways I could collaborate with someone to bring this vision to life. So I guess it was the first time that I've ever written something in a collaborative way. That was different.
Which is often not the way when writing fiction, is it? Like sometimes it feels like you're kind of a solo, whereas in theatre or drag or loads of other things, often you'd be collaborating in lots of ways. Although I guess you're quite well practiced in thinking visually when you're writing because of drag performance as a part of it.
No, because with like I'm writing for a bit of a higher age range, I think, than you two, which is like 8 to 12 to 14, to this sort of age range that the book chapter books, the books, but I think a lot of the way I write is the character of the narrator. I always like visualize them as myself in drag almost, and like when I talk about these drag story times, I want to do that as the character. Everything is like through this lens of this character, which I've kind of channeled everything into, which is like it's really visual and almost like this pantomime villain. And the writer's not a villain, but they carry themselves like a pantomime villain, even though they're not a villain. They're very like. So I think a lot of the story is something that only someone who does drag could write. I think there's a lot of that in there, but I think I think it's a lot more visual and a lot more. I want the crazy cast of characters. I want the fun and the comedy and the horror and like absurd things that I feel like I've had a lot more fun. I don't know when or if I'll go back to like writing novels for adults, because this is just so much more fun and so much more crazy cool.
Bria, I think we should probably finish at the end. We should wrap it up, because otherwise we'll get kicked out.
I'll be quick with this. So I think one of the things I remember Jay kind of teaching me when I kind of gave him like a mini draft when I was writing Rainbow Library, and he basically went through and said, cut that, no need for that, be more short with that, this is way too long. Basically, I kind of just going through and say, you need to be more brutal with how you write things. You're writing for an audience that has a short attention span. You need to make sure they're like paying attention at all points.
Yeah.
And even though you could say this only applies for children's lit, it also applies to kind of any form of like writing exercise that you do, and that like there's only so much fluff you can have. You really do need to kind of cut to the quick of it, like from the word go. Because whilst we can all say, oh, I'm writing for myself, I'm not writing for an audience. At the end of the day, you do want someone to read your book. So that's kind of that's like one of the main things that's kind of really because I'm someone who very much liked long flowy sentences and obscenely long paragraphs, and kind of I really had to kind of like change my direction to say, nope, it's got to be shorter, it's got to be quicker, get to the goddamn point. And I think that's something that like Jay just kind of like drilled into my head when like I was kind of like crafting this whole thing.
Which got you to the good stuff as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right to the heart of it. I think that's all we have time for. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you to Libby.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you for you watching at home. Not anyone watching.
It's all about the fact.